Okay, hello and welcome to the briefing room. My name is Anna Scarbeck and I'm CEO of Climateworks Centre at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. Today we're kicking off our briefing room series for 2022. The series will be covering different facets of the net zero solution for Australia and for our region. First, let's begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from which everyone is dialing in today for this event. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Perhaps you might like to tell us where you're dialing in from in the chat. Today, we're focusing on many parts of Australia's lands outside of the major cities that have become host to heavy industry, which of course accounts for a large percentage of emissions in Australia. And today specifically, we're talking about the solutions that these industrial regions can adopt to transition to net zero regions and the clustering approach they can take to attract new investment and remain industrial powerhouses in a net zero emissions world. Over 90% of the world's emissions are now covered by nations with net zero goals. The majority of Australian banks have committed to align their portfolios to net zero, as have many major businesses and investment institutions here and worldwide. And at Climateworks, we specialise in net zero emissions pathways and helping business and governments accelerate their implementation. Of course, the sooner we catalyse the systems transformations that make net zero emissions possible, the safer our planet will be for all of us and for all children who deserve to enjoy it as we have. And we can enable Australia to thrive as a net zero emissions solution provider for other nations too. So today we're going to focus on the how of net zero, and we'll present a couple of ways that we're working from a place-based perspective focused on industry. Over the next hour, you'll hear from two of my colleagues who are working with regionally focused decarbonisation programs. First, Rupert Posner, our Sustainable Economies lead, will give some insight into why decarbonisation in the regions is so important and how creating industrial precincts powered by low-cost renewable energy can support the regions in the net zero transition. And second, Rob Kelly, our industry system lead at Climateworks, will share the latest from the Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative, or Industry ETI as we call it, that we're co-convening with Climate Kick, bringing together some of the biggest emitters in heavy industry to co-design pathways and develop tangible actions towards net zero in 5 supply chains. These Industry ETI participants have been working together for almost 2 years and yesterday published their latest report in the program, showing what reaching near net zero looks like in 5 industrial regions in Australia. And we'll also have a contribution from Meredith England from Climate Kick, our co-convener on the Australian Industry ETI program. Then we'll be taking questions from you, the audience listening live. So please add them in the Q&A section during the discussion on your screen. And we aim to wrap all of this up within the hour. So let's begin. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Rupert Posner. He leads our Sustainable Economies System team at Climateworks, supporting the development of net zero strategies and aligned policy. His team encourages green economic diversification with consideration of economic and development co-benefits. Rupert's been working in the climate change and environmental field for many decades. He's worked for state governments across Australia and internationally, and as a policy advisor in Canberra, and worked in multinational corporations. So over to you, Rupert.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Anna, and thanks to all of you who are joining us here today. Look, I think we've all noticed that there's been a really big shift here in Australia on climate change over the last few weeks. And we're also seeing the impact of an increasingly interlinked and dependent global economy. So with this in mind, I think it's worth reiterating some of the significant shifts that are affecting our global supply chains. At least 1/5 of the world's 2,000 largest public companies have committed to net zero targets. And investors are increasingly seeing high carbon industries as a risk, and more than $40 trillion in assets worldwide has begun or been committed to divestment from fossil fuels. And as Anna mentioned, we've now seen more than 140 countries that have committed to net zero targets. So by definition, these markets will increasingly demand zero emission products. So it's not difficult to see the impact this could have on the Australian economy if we don't change how we produce our products. And if we do nothing, there's a huge risk. But if we adapt, there are massive opportunities. So as Anna said, today we're focusing on a central part of the Australian economy that faces this great risk or opportunity. Our industrial regions can take advantage of the global shifts towards decarbonisation by playing a central role in emission reduction initiatives. So by creating industrial precincts powered by low-cost renewable energy, what we refer to as renewable energy industrial precincts, or REIPs, will help Australia to maintain existing energy-dependent industries and attract new ones. So REIPs support a cluster of industrial businesses powered by renewable energy. These precincts are either located within renewable energy zones or connected to renewable energy generation through transmission, obviously. So they would have access to renewable hydrogen production, a skilled workforce, and common infrastructure, energy, transport, and the like. And we know Australia has abundant renewable energy resources, and supply is increasing with the establishment of renewable energy zones by state governments around the country. And by co-locating industry in precincts, they can benefit through leveraging low-cost renewable energy, as well as the shared infrastructure, labour, and other inputs. REIPs are ideal for regions with energy-intensive industries, such as aluminium smelting and other metals processing, chemicals production, recycling, and data centres. And sort of feel I need to mention this because we think of everything being up in the cloud as being, light and having no impact. But in fact, perhaps what we need to be referring to these are data factories, because they're actually huge sources of greenhouse emissions. And we know data centres now are on a par with global aviation emissions. So a really important industrial emission that we need to address. But these REIPs are also an opportunity to provide a home for new clean industries, making wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicle chargers, electric buses, mining equipment. There are huge, exciting opportunities. So while I don't expect you to read all the information on this image here, it does show about a dozen locations around Australia that would lend themselves to REIPs. And while these regions clearly differ with regard to industry focus, energy resources, and so on, the common element for REIPs in all these regions is to bring about the clean energy-led industrial growth. And we've heard plenty of talk about hydrogen hubs, I'm sure you have. Now, if we overlay where they're considered, it's not surprising that hydrogen is aligned with these locations, and renewable hydrogen could be a huge support for energy-intensive industries. Now, obviously, just being a good idea isn't enough to make these happen. We're going to need significant public and private sector effort to coordinate activities to make them a reality, building the enabling infrastructure and supporting and encouraging existing and new industries. The good news is that state, territory, and federal governments have already allocated some funding towards initiatives to support this. The New South Wales government has embarked on a comprehensive industrial decarbonisation program for its high-emitting industries and regions, the Net Zero Industry and Innovation Program. And there's a new low-carbon industry foundation stream that supports the development of roadmaps for clean manufacturing precincts in the Hunter Valley and Illawarra. Convening stakeholders is really important, including stakeholders such as industry, local council, unions, business group, regional advisory groups, traditional owners. If they can co-design decarbonisation roadmaps, it provides a really strong way to get these developed in such a way that benefits the whole community. They will ensure that these roadmaps are truly place-based and fit the regional context in which they're located. We're also seeing action across the country to build common user infrastructure to support industrial regions with renewable energy. We're seeing renewable energy zones across the eastern seaboard, and Victoria's commitment to offshore wind are great examples of the kind of investment in infrastructure that will be needed to deliver renewable energy to industrial hubs. The Victorian Government's Low Carbon Manufacturing Grants Program, the New South Wales Government's High Emitting Industry stream of the Net Zero Industry and Innovation Program. There's lots of long names here, they're quite hard to say. And the West Australian Government's Heavy Industry Low Carbon Transition CRC. These are all really good examples of support for decarbonising existing industries. And of course, as I mentioned before, we're seeing funding for hydrogen hubs across the country. Okay, so this might take you back, if you remember, to Kim Beazley and his Noodle Nation. And, certainly that's actually my intent. This only has some of the programs that are available at the moment. And it shows that while there's progress across the country, this funding is still patchwork in nature, and there is a risk that there will be a proliferation of small programs that don't have as much impact as they could. Transitioning Australia's major industrial regions to zero emissions will be a significant system-wide undertaking. And my colleague Rob will talk about some of the numbers later, but we're talking about billions of dollars, and that's just for one region. So we need to send a really strong signal to the market to get it to invest rapidly and at scale. We need these programs to be brought together, scaled up and accelerated. We need to share a decarbonisation goal for all our major industrial regions and strong collaboration across government to drive further industrial innovation and attract even greater private investment for the regions. So rather than providing grants for bits of kit, we need to see goal-oriented approach to funding, goals specific to decarbonisation of industry sectors. And by setting an overall goal, it means the investment can create a pull to the market in addition to the push from the injection of funding. Goal-oriented investing is more likely to catalyse clean technology market supply chains in a way that providing for a single asset will not achieve this. And we've seen some success with this in the past. The large-scale solar rounds that was done by the federal government, we saw it continued to drive down costs and deliver more impact. We need to ensure that we get the most we can from government funding. State government money needs to be paired with grants from the federal government and supported by low-interest finance from the CEFC. Collectively, they can have a much greater impact and generate more private capital. And from the map, it's pretty clear that we need to have a national program, as we need all of these regions to decarbonise. We can't wait for them to do it one at a time. Now, the time is certainly right for collaboration. States are working together in ways we haven't seen for quite some time, and the federal government is speaking the right language of working together. So if we can get governments to work together and set ambitious goals with coordinated funding, we can see a real shift at scale and in the time frame that we need. I'll hand back to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Rupert, for that great overview and deep dive. For those who've just joined us or during that presentation, welcome to our first briefing room event for 2022 from Climateworks Centre at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. We're focusing today on decarbonising regional Australia. Remember, if you've got a question for our panellists, you can add it to the Q&A section of your screen and we'll get to those shortly. Before we do, we're now going to hear from Rob Kelly. Rob is Climateworks Industry System Lead, where he focuses on key intervention points to enable large-scale decarbonisation in heavy industry. And Rob is Program Director for the Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative, or the Industry ETI. Industry ETI has just released their report yesterday called Setting Up Industrial Regions for Net Zero, which profiles the opportunities for decarbonisation in 5 industrial regions. Over to you, Rob, to tell us about it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anna, and thanks to everyone who has joined. Now, as Rupert has said, significant shifts are taking place in decarbonising global supply chains. But in our latest work, we are finding that there are opportunities for industrial regions that they can take advantage of to reduce emissions and prepare for these shifts. As Anna mentioned yesterday, we did release a report focused on the opportunities for decarbonisation in the regions of the Pilbara and also Kwinana in WA, Hunter and Illawarra in New South Wales, and Gladstone in Queensland. And this report puts numbers to the size of the opportunity and scale of investment required to decarbonise these regions. And as Rupert mentioned, it's fair to say that these numbers are incredibly significant. The report analysed the opportunities for emissions reductions across heavy industry supply chains and found that an 88% cut to industry emissions is possible and would set up these industrial regions for the transition to net zero. The report finds that the technologies to achieve this level of decarbonisation are generally mature and available to be deployed, or are proven but not yet commercial. And so to achieve the scale of decarbonisation, we'll need a coordinated effort across industry, governments and communities, and also finance and energy sectors to align the policy, regulations and programs and create clear goals and the investment confidence that will be critical to enabling this abatement at scale. Now, importantly, this research has been done working side by side with Australia's largest industrial players. This isn't being done independently by researchers. It is informed and supported by a critical mass of Australia's industrial economy. And the industry ETI brings together 18 industry partners representing about 30% of the ASX 100 market cap. And the initiative is co-convened by Climateworks Centre and Climate Kick, and brings in expert research from CSIRO, the Energy Transitions Commission, RMI and Bloomberg NEF to ensure that it has access to the most up-to-date and rigorous research. And the initiative is looking at these the highest priority issues in driving industry towards net zero emissions. And if we go to the next chart, this helps explain why we have focused on place-based decarbonisation and 5 regions in particular. Now, Australia's industrial regions are really significant in terms of their emissions, their energy use and their contribution to the economy. The supply chains that we look at, iron and steel, aluminium, LNG, other metals and chemicals, just in 5 regions, Pilbara, Kwinana, Hunter, Illawarra and Gladstone, make up 16% of Australia's total emissions. So 79 megatons of carbon dioxide each year, which is about an eighth of our total emissions. They also contribute over $160 billion to Australia's GDP. So when we think about an intense concentration of emissions, both in process terms, but also in geographical terms, and also the importance of the Australian economy, they really get more intense than this, particularly outside of capital cities, where we generally think of when we think about this level of concentration. Now, the report has identified the extent of the opportunities in these regions. If we go to the next slide, it's found 70 megatons of abatement potential across these regions and supply chains. As mentioned before, that's an 88% reduction on current emissions, is about the equivalent of removing all emissions from cars and light commercial vehicles in Australia. But achieving this requires a significant effort, requires an unprecedented transformation of the energy system, with a priority of delivering low-cost, decarbonised, firmed electricity supply that will be needed for these types of industrial processes, and also a green hydrogen market at scale. The work also quantifies the investment and employment implications of this sort of opportunity, finding that an employment opportunity of 212 to 461,000 jobs, depending on the options deployed, could be unlocked, most of which would be in the construction of renewable energy, renewable electricity capacity, storage and hydrogen electrolyzers. And these construction type jobs generally last between 6 to 24 months. So if we are spreading out that investment evenly, it would generate about 10 to 20,000 jobs per annum on average. The size of the bubbles on this chart show the relative size of the opportunity for emissions abatement identified. The largest opportunity identified in the Pilbara, an extensive region in northwest WA. It's actually equivalent to the size of Spain. So an enormous area with home to a huge amount of export-oriented industries like iron ore, LNG and chemicals, which have a combined annual economic output of $88 billion. Gladstone also represents a significant opportunity across its LNG, aluminium and chemicals sectors. The Hunter, we've also profiled, one of Australia's largest and most diverse regional economies, contributes about $50 billion to gross product, and this has a diverse industry mix of aluminium, steel, chemicals, advanced manufacturing, agriculture, coal mining and energy production. The Illawarra, a region dominated by steel production, and the Port Kembla Steelworks being the major facility there, which transitioning that facility of that scale would require a huge undertaking. A shift to green steel making would require massive quantities of decarbonised electricity and hydrogen, and that needs to be planned in advance as we're looking to shift quite a unlock large capacity all at once. Kwinana is the smallest region profiled. That's 40 kilometres south of Perth in Western Australia. But this area is home to alumina refining, ammonia, fertilisers, chemicals production, nickel refining and battery mineral processing, as well as cement and a range of other supporting industries. It's an interesting region in that it faces a lot of land constraints, and therefore investment is needed to really ensure that decarbonised electricity and energy can be brought into that region either through electrons or molecules such as ammonia or hydrogen. Now, across these regions, the scale of renewable energy required to unlock the abatement that we've identified would require an additional 68 to 126 terawatt hours of energy. And now, just to help you understand that scale, if a watt is $1, a terawatt is $1 trillion. So we might be familiar with kilowatt scale solar systems on our roofs. Our large wind farms are currently megawatt sized, up to about 1,000 megawatts. But beyond a megawatt, we have a gigawatt, which is at another 3 zeros, and then add another 3 zeros to get a terawatt. So we are talking orders of magnitude above some of the scale of energy capacity that we're used to thinking about to unlock these types of opportunities. Another sense of scale, in 2021, Australia generated 265 terawatt hours of electricity, and 64 terawatt hours was from renewables. But the renewable energy we've identified that would be required in these 5 industrial regions would be equivalent to 26 to 47% of Australia's total electricity generation, and would be either a doubling or a tripling of the total current generation from renewable sources. Now, these are the types of numbers that even people who work directly in this space find surprising, which goes to show just how far we have to come to really appreciate the scale of this transition and the importance of planning for an effective transition and really aligning the incentives to making sure there's a very strong investment signal to unlock this transition at scale. So when we put this all together on what it means for the transition, we find there are a few overarching themes that are emerging. And the first theme, not surprisingly, is that there is a need for a large-scale investment and deployment of renewable energy infrastructure and measures that improve energy system efficiency and flexibility. The report itself recommends aligning targets at a state and national level with net zero emissions in industrial regions, including regional decarbonisation in energy system planning, like the ISP and WA's whole of system plan. Recommends developing the energy systems that will be needed tomorrow and start to develop and plan for them today through renewable energy zones and transmission infrastructure needed to ensure that when these plants are ready to be transitioned, that the energy is going to be there. And also the need for strategic alignment of the supporting mechanisms to ensure there are strong investment signals for this transition. Secondly, we need coordination. It's an incredibly complex space, and Coordination is needed to enable a system-wide transition in industrial regions, given the complexity and the number of stakeholders required for an effective transition. Thirdly, we also need enhanced collaboration between entities, given the scale and complexity of the challenges. We know this is beyond what a single organisation can achieve acting alone. And finally, we know we need to act now. So urgent action is needed, of course, to avoid the worst risks of climate change. But action is also needed now to set up these regions to transition more effectively over the coming decades and build the skills and capabilities and the resources to develop world-leading competitiveness in a new economy. So, as Rupert has said, the global shift to decarbonisation does indeed present potential risks for countries like Australia and its regions. But our work is also showing there are substantial opportunities. Australia has some of the most enviable renewable resources in the world, abundant solar radiation and strong onshore and offshore wind reserves. And much of this is in proximity to existing and planned industrial centres, such as those we've studied. Australia needs to be looking forward to capture these opportunities while supporting and developing new industries, attracting jobs and investment, particularly in our industrial regions. Where these opportunities can be realised, there are clear benefits for employment, as well as resilience within these regions, and also for the nation as a whole. So back to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Rob. And hopefully everyone in the audience has now got an increased appreciation for the scale of the transition and the breadth of the work that's been undertaken and the contribution that this can make now to forward planning. So I've seen that the questions are beginning to flow in. Thank you very much to those of you in the audience. We'll get to those shortly. Before we do, I'd like to invite a contribution from our co-conveners on the Australian Industry and ETI program, Climate Kick. Meredith England and her colleagues in the Climate Kick team worked alongside the Climateworks industry system team and our industry partners to develop the content in the report that Rob's just spoken to. So welcome, Meredith. I'd love you to delve into the question of, in particular, the coordination and collaboration that Rob spoke about. And could you share with us your views on what are some of the differences between the regions studied on what is required for coordination and collaboration?
Thanks, Anna. So I'll give you, apologies. I'll give you a flavour of some of the differences across the regions, many of which you heard Rob talk about just now. So, for instance, Kwinana, which is part of the Western Trade Coast, it's a metropolitan area south of Perth. It's got a really long history of successful industry collaboration through the Kwinana Industry Council. And the KIC has been working on a carbon reduction plan. So there's quite a industry-led approach, I guess I would say, there in Kwinana. The Pilbara, in contrast, is a vast region with a history of highly competitive organisations and energy and transport infrastructure that has been owned by single organisations. So industry there are willing and, for the most part, ready to work together with each other and with government where there's common need and mutual benefit, but it's likely to look more like the government taking a lead in bringing everyone to the table up there. And as you heard from Rupert, in New South Wales, the state government's already working with industry through emissions intensity reductions programs, particularly with a focus on decarbonisation roadmaps. So state government is really taking a role there, bringing organisations and stakeholders together. So it's probably useful to point out, when we're talking about coordination, we're talking about a substantial government role, working together with industry, finance and investment, the energy sector and communities. And then collaboration is really the need for industrial entities to come together themselves in regions and creating mutual benefit and addressing those common needs. So there are really similar needs across the regions. I'll just touch on some of them. Coordination is really needed across 4 fronts in all of these regions. So the first is aligning policy and regulation across state and federal government. And we've certainly heard the need for that and how that's been spelled out. Secondly, government can support regional stakeholders to come together and develop decarbonisation roadmaps and plans. And that's already starting in some areas, like in New South Wales. Thirdly, government can play a key enabling role across a range of technology maturities, from stimulating R&D to procurement and targets, mandates, all the way through to aligned policy, regulation and standards. And what's really important here is that learning needs to be shared and facilitated across both the technology development efforts that we're talking about and the roadmaps that I mentioned earlier. There's a real desire for regions to be learning from each other, for organisations to be learning from each other, and also drawing on what's happening overseas. So in collaboration, there are a few sort of focus areas, particularly around technology. Industry developing new models and mechanisms for collaboration. It's in some areas they're historically good at it, in others not so much. So really trying to find what are the mechanisms that make it possible for them to collaborate in these new and complex spaces. For industry to also get together and collaborate on aligning policy and regulation to net zero. So being able to take a role informing and shaping what government's doing together. And really also industry coming together to take an active engagement role in the regional leadership and coordination efforts, particularly where government is stepping in for industry to step up and get involved, and particularly learning from each other across those different regions and internationally. So that's a bit of a flavour of what's needed in collaboration and coordination. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks very much, Meredith. And indeed, I think you've answered one of the questions from the audience. Gabrielle had asked, how do we streamline the decarbonisation of regional Australia when there's such a diverse group of stakeholders, energy companies, community groups, governments involved in the transition to renewables? So Gabrielle, I hope that Meredith's 4 categories there provided some helpful pointers, and the report certainly sets out more of that. Is there anything else, Meredith, that you wanted to add on that streamlining point?
I guess I would say it's complex. So it's not as easy as just getting everybody in the room and let's come up with a plan, and great, we have a plan, let's now implement it. And people have tried that in lots of other areas in the past. This challenge that we're in is complex, and it requires a real pace of change. And I guess that it requires simultaneous changes across business models, policy and regulation, how finance and investment is working, industry strategy. So that simultaneity is, I guess, not to be underestimated. We think that there's a real desire and there are models and mechanisms for this kind of coordination. I would like to say, I don't think it's going to be easy, but necessary. And within this complexity, I think we've got a lot of stakeholders, diverse stakeholders, really ready to do it together.
Thank you. There was a related question. I might bring Rupert into this. This was a question about REAPs in particular, REAPs being Renewable Energy Industrial Precincts, which is a way to address some of this streamlining that Rupert spoke about in setting up for goal-oriented investment. Christine has asked in the chat, will REAPs require additional governance structures beyond what state governments can offer? Rupert, is there anything further you wanted to add on that one?
Yeah, look, I don't think it'd be so much about structures, but it would be about more ambitious plans. I mean, I think what's really clear from all of the presentations is there's so much that needs to be done and it needs to happen so quickly. But there needs to be that goal. And some of the other people have brought up different questions about how do you include other things. There's no reason why you can't include Indigenous employment, for example, as part of a requirement for one of these precincts. And by going through and being really clear about what you want to achieve, then much more can be done. And so I think there is a real need, I think, for government to be more ambitious in a national program, because just doing little ones here and there is not going to send the really clear signal to industry that actually we're looking for it all to change. And when industry realises that everything's changing, then they're going to lean in a whole lot more because they know things are not going to stay the same. And so the amount of energy and enthusiasm, commitment and dollars that you're going to get will be so much higher if that they can see that the game is changing, and it's changing everywhere.
Thanks, Rupert. You spoke about broadening the goals, and we have indeed had questions about whether food and agriculture value adding might be added into these regions. And there was also a question about circular economy. And so I wonder if you wanted to add anything, Rupert, and whether Rob wanted to come in here. Megan's asked, there's a lot of talk and focus on circular economy at the moment. How is this being considered as part of these regional hubs?
Well, there's a couple of ways that it can be factored in, but I think the idea of precincts means that we're talking about not just decarbonising one business and try to think about how collectively that they can benefit. And the circular economy is what is one company's waste can be an asset for somebody else, or something that might not be worth investing in sufficiently for one business becomes much more attractive if more businesses are involved. And so addressing circular economy, about ensuring that, you know, the community's involved. You think about all of these things together, then you can address so many more issues and things become more cost effective as well. So there's some real benefits to this approach.
I think a really good point, Rupert. And I think looking at circular economy at a precinct scale offers a lot of advantages. You know, if you are finding users of different waste streams within a precinct, you're definitely going to reduce the overall costs of transportation, and it can become a business case. One area we looked at in our first phase report on how circular economy and using these waste streams might be able to bring forward some of the opportunities for decarbonisation was looking at potentially looking at green hydrogen as one of these opportunities. So electrolysis to produce green hydrogen produces two streams, a hydrogen output and an oxygen output. You know, there may be companies that require a high quality stream of oxygen to use as an input in their processes, and providing that oxygen stream might actually reduce the overall costs of green hydrogen production, enabling that opportunity to come on earlier than it would otherwise be available.
Thanks, Rob. Now that you've mentioned hydrogen, I might stay with you, as we've had a couple of questions from the audience about hydrogen, and I'll share them both, and you can address them together. One was about the costs. How in the analysis do you think about the cost of transitioning when the existing or incumbent technologies are a lower cost or a different cost, and then to the newer technologies, for example, the $2 a kilo goal for hydrogen? And a related question, another question from Natalie, was around the question of clean hydrogen is green hydrogen, and how have you approached the discussion that the green hydrogen is the only type of hydrogen that we should be producing in the future for reducing carbon emissions?
Fantastic, thanks, Anna. So I might tackle the last one first on the type of hydrogen, and I think that is an interesting it is an interesting question, and it comes back to a whole range of technological factors as well as environmental factors in terms of which type of hydrogen would be preferred. An interesting insight that's coming from our work, particularly the first phase report that was released previously, it does seem that in the long run that producing hydrogen using electrolysis does become the lowest cost form of decarbonised hydrogen production. But in the near term, I think it's still up for debate as what the preferred technology is. Now, for the report that we've released, we have, I guess, looked to the end state rather than the pathway. And looking at the end state, we have assumed that this opportunity comes on and is delivered through green hydrogen. And that's the analysis we've been doing. Although in the next phase, we'll have a bit more of a look at that pathway dependency, I suppose. You know, looking at what really is needed to get hydrogen markets up and running in the near term, and the technology mix that might play into that. So I think that's an interesting question. Now I think the first question, if you just remind me, Anna,
just about cost, which I think was where you're referring with this, with what's coming in the next phase of work, is looking at the transition path and how you transition from bringing the costs the costs from the future towards today, and how you're managing that in your analysis.
Yeah, fantastic. I think cost is a really important point. You know, we are talking about globally integrated supply chains, you know, ones that are extremely cost sensitive, and supply chains where international competitiveness will play a huge role in terms of, you know, what these industries look like in the future and the contribution they make to the economy. What we are finding, which is really encouraging, is that many of the opportunities are available for deployment. You know, we see, you know, of course, like we've seen with renewable energy, solar and wind is now the lowest cost of new generation capacity. And as we look forward, it will become even more so as costs continue to come down. And, you know, we're seeing renewable energy, of course, less exposed to some of the global shocks that we see in energy markets, you know, particularly those that are export exposed. So there are opportunities now which can help reduce costs and build resilience. We know that there are others that are still emerging, not yet cost competitive. And so really the focus needs to be how, you know, what are the effective measures that can really bring forward their deployment and realize this opportunity in an effective way, so that we're setting up for the industries we need in the future.
Thank you. And while we've got you, Rob, there was also a technical question about transmission. Does your analysis of the renewable generation infrastructure include the transmission network when you're thinking about the scale of what's required?
So transmission is hugely important when we think about scale. The analysis that we've done, interestingly, those really large investment figures do not include the transmission and distribution infrastructure. So we know that is additional. So we haven't yet done the analysis in this report for what is needed in terms of grid augmentation to deliver energy at the scale needed to these regions, but we are working on energy system modelling as part of our next phase, and so that's work that's been done as we're setting up our pathways to net zero for the next report.
And just on that point, I mean, one of the reasons why we're talking about precincts is, you know, quite often locating them where there's renewable energy generation. I mean, we're trying to be efficient in how we approach these challenges that we've got, and by integrating these things together, I mean, absolutely, we're going to need a whole lot more transmission. There's no doubt about that as we electrify the whole economy. But by putting these in strategic locations, producing hydrogen that can be used for the industries, we can look to do this in the most efficient way. And by planning them on a precinct level rather than individual, we can make sure that we get the necessary infrastructure that will be available for all of the industry that's in that precinct.
Thanks, Rupert. And while we've got you, there was a question that touched on what you were talking about earlier. This question was about how do we get policy certainty? And you were describing earlier the power of setting goals at the regional level, and that we do in fact have a situation now where every government in Australia, state and federal, has a net zero commitment. And I wonder if you might elaborate a little on what would it look like to translate that commitment down to these regions and apply that, as you talked about, to bring the patchwork together.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think it's all been pretty clear that we haven't had the policy certainty that we've needed, and certainly having an integrated national approach is certainly easier for businesses that operate in more than one state. And so, you know, they want to see certainty and they want to see consistency. Saying that, we can't have consistency being the lowest common denominator. And that's the reason why the states have been acting, because if we'd had the same as the national level, that is not what consumers and customers and shareholders are expecting of companies. And that's why companies have been leading further, and that's why states have been leading further. But the more that we can get consistency, the better, but only if it is at that high standard. And we know that that commitment to net zero is going to require the complete decarbonisation of our industrial sector. And so by setting those goals, making it really clear, by putting the right policies in place with clear signals for what the intent is, that will help. And by bringing these programs together so that we have sufficient scale of the amount of money that's needed, will help to support the transition that we need. But I think the signs are reasonably promising. I mean, there's a bunch of good policy that's out there, there's no doubt about that, but there needs to be more, and it needs to be better integrated. But the signs are positive. States are working together in a way we haven't seen for a long time on a whole range of issues, and we have a government federally that's sending the signals that it wants to collaborate on this.
Thanks. There's many questions flowing in, and we're not going to be able to get to them all, but I might draw Meredith in. There's a question about many regions that are rich in resources know about the experience of boom and bust times in the past. And I wonder if you might draw on, it's part of the planning and coordination that you were discussing earlier, and some of your thoughts on what's the latest thinking in helping communities transition smoothly towards this future.
Thanks. I think this kind of connects to the last question as well, thinking about the goals and how that might play out at a regional level. I think if we connect that through to the idea of regional roadmaps, that can be really useful as well, so that you've got regional stakeholders coming together, which in response to this question, what we're hearing in all of the different regions that we've been working in is that that always needs to include community, and that the ways that stakeholders are talking about the vision for particular regions, it's industrial decarbonisation coming together with economic development and social equity. And we're hearing that all over the place. And so I think all of the industrial stakeholders and the government recognise that communities need to be part of these. If we attach it to that roadmap process, which has different forms and at different levels of maturity around the country, I think that can be a useful attractor and a mechanism for bringing communities in. So that includes in particular sort of workers recognising the workforce skills, but also Indigenous communities in the area, and residents and all of the people that are, it's industrial clusters aren't just sort of big, heavy industry organisations, they're also the communities that have built around them with the schools and the hairdressers and the shops. So making sure there are ways of bringing them into the vision setting and the planning process around decarbonisation roadmaps and the ongoing flexible approach to implementing that. This is not a short game, this is a long game. And that's really important to communities as well, to have, I guess, a really enduring commitment to getting this done. And Rupert was talking about that national perspective and the national goal. I think translating that down into the regions for communities to know the people who are helping make this happen, whether it's the state government, whether it's a regional government, whether it's industry-led, that it's an enduring presence there to keep the community connected.
That final comment is a great link to what's unleashed in the chat. There's a hunger for deep dialogue on this, and there's been an offer from one of the questions from Jody about sharing thoughts that they've been working on about what a national centre for regional transition might look like, with thinking around co-design, government, industry, community to come together. There's been comments and questions that we won't have time to get to about helping waste to energy plants and other types of circular economy solutions find their place amongst the patchwork of support that's been fragmented to date. And I think some of the solutions that our panellists have shared provide perhaps a focus point for those trying to navigate, and also a clear message that addressing the patchwork is something that this sort of coordinated approach can help. I think what we've shown here is that there is a great hunger and interest in many regions and many industries, and in doing this well. And I recognise that we are running out of time for this particular dialogue today, but we have been able to capture the questions, and we invite all of you in the audience to remain engaged with this work. The industry ETI has another phase of research to undertake on the technologies, and Climateworks and Climateworks will remain engaging in these particular regions, and the regional, the REIPs, the Renewable Energy Industrial Precincts, are a potential for greater scale of action. But it will require engagement from all of you involved in this, so that we can harness this interest that we know those of you are showing by turning up today, and that many in the regions that we've worked with have indicated that there's great hunger for. So I'd invite you to work with us and help bring that voice to those in government who we're trying to help coordinate and allow industry and government and community to work really well together, and really kickstart this process of regional roadmaps and goal-oriented coordinated investment for both the long game but also the inclusive game. So I'd like to thank all of you who've contributed to the dialogue, those of you who've posted comments and chats, and those of you on the screen, the panellists that we've heard from today, Meredith England, Rob Kelly and Rupert Posner. And I'd also like to thank all of the participants in the regions that have been part of analysing these opportunities, discussing what's involved in bringing them to life, and in shaping the research that has led to the presentations that you've heard from today. And hope that you can remain very engaged in it and understand and take from today the message of scale, and the need to act now, but also that message of potential, that these solutions are within our grasp. It's time for all of us to lean in and help make sure we can grasp them, so that it's a smooth and yet quick transition, given the urgency with which we need to transition, both to avoid the risk but also to harness the opportunities. And finally, I'd like to thank the team behind the scenes. These sorts of reports and webinars don't just happen by themselves, and we've been well supported by an excellent team at Climateworks and with our partners, and helping us today, Simon Leo Brown, Sophie Stefanakis, Kalia Colston and Carolina Odrevsky, excuse me. And so I'd love you to continue to stay engaged with not just this topic, but also, as you can see on the screen, out the rest of our briefing room series. So our next topic is the twin challenge of tackling climate change while preserving nature. And you can join us for that on Tuesday, the 12th of July, and we'll be in touch shortly with a link to register for that. We will also be sending through a recording from this session, and those of you who've registered will receive that, and you can find out and listen to all of our past briefing room series at our website, which is climateworkscentre.org. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this and you're far better briefed than you were previously, and hopefully excited and ready to stay engaged and help us seize this moment and do what we know is possible, and also what is needed. So please join us in that effort and join us at future briefing rooms. Thanks again to all our panellists. Have a good day.